The first thing Daniel Carter heard was screaming. The second was metal tearing apart. Then the world disappeared beneath him. Daniel had been sitting beside a small window aboard Flight 718, photographing the endless Arctic landscape below. For hours, there had been nothing except white mountains, frozen lakes, and clouds stretching toward the horizon. There were 17 people aboard the aircraft. Daniel was traveling north to photograph Arctic wildlife for an independent expedition. Everything had been normal, until the left engine exploded. A violent blast shook the aircraft. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers screamed as luggage flew through the cabin. Daniel grabbed the seat in front of him. The aircraft tilted sharply. Through the window, he saw nothing but white. The pilot fought desperately to regain control. Then the second engine failed. The plane began falling. Daniel heard the pilot shouting something over the radio. "Mayday! Mayday!" The radio went silent. The aircraft struck the ice. The impact was enormous. Daniel's seat tore loose. His body slammed against the cabin wall. Glass exploded around him. Then everything went black. When Daniel opened his eyes, the cabin was upside down. Snow was blowing through a massive hole in the fuselage. The emergency lights flickered. Someone was crying. Someone else was screaming for help. Daniel tried to move. Pain shot through his shoulder. He forced himself upright. Is anyone alive? No answer. He crawled through the broken cabin. The pilot was dead. Several passengers were trapped beneath seats. Others had been thrown from the aircraft. Daniel checked one person after another. Nothing. Outside, a brutal Arctic wind screamed across the ice. Daniel eventually found one passenger still breathing. A young woman named Emma. She was unconscious but alive. Daniel pulled her from the wreckage. Then he looked around. The aircraft had crashed in a valley surrounded by enormous frozen mountains. There were no roads, no buildings, no radio towers, nothing. Daniel checked his phone. No signal. The temperature was falling rapidly. Emma opened her eyes. Where are we? Daniel looked across the endless white landscape. He didn't know, but he knew one thing. If they stayed beside the wreckage without shelter, they would freeze before anyone found them. Daniel tightened his jacket. We survived tonight. Far above them, the storm clouds were closing in. And somewhere beneath the broken aircraft, something was still flashing. A red warning light. Daniel spent the next hour turning the wreckage into shelter. The wind had become stronger. Snow was beginning to cover the aircraft. Emma could barely walk. Daniel wrapped her in an emergency blanket and searched the cargo area for supplies. He found 3 bottles of water, 2 energy bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a lighter, and 1 emergency flare. That was everything. Daniel looked outside. The Arctic darkness was approaching. How long until rescue? Emma asked. Daniel didn't answer. He knew the aircraft had disappeared from radar. If the emergency signal hadn't transmitted, rescuers might not even know where they had crashed. They needed to create a signal. Daniel dragged pieces of metal from the wreckage and arranged them in a large pattern on the snow. Then he used strips of aircraft fabric to create a bright marker. But the storm swallowed everything in minutes. Inside the wreckage, Daniel treated Emma's injured leg. She asked him how he knew what to do. My father taught me. Was he a pilot? No. Daniel paused. He was a mountain rescue officer. Emma looked at him. Then you're going to get us out. Daniel wanted to believe her. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing. The broken aircraft groaned as the wind pushed against it. Daniel found several seat cushions and used them to block the largest opening. They huddled together beneath emergency blankets. Hours passed. Emma began shivering uncontrollably. Daniel kept talking to her. He told stories about his childhood. Anything to keep her awake. Around midnight, the storm became terrifying. The entire aircraft shook. Then Daniel heard something. A low mechanical sound. He crawled toward the broken cockpit. For a moment, he thought it was another aircraft. But there was nothing outside. The sound disappeared. Daniel returned to the cabin. Emma was staring toward the rear of the plane. What? Daniel asked. I saw a light. Daniel grabbed the flashlight. Where? She pointed through the broken fuselage. Far across the valley, a tiny light moved through the darkness. Daniel watched it. It disappeared behind a ridge, then reappeared. Daniel's heart raced. Someone was out there, but no rescue aircraft could fly in this storm. He reached for the emergency flare, then stopped. The light suddenly went out. The valley became completely dark. Daniel whispered, "Who is out there?" Something answered from the distance. 3 short flashes, then silence. Morning arrived without sunlight. The storm had buried half the aircraft. Daniel climbed outside. The cold immediately burned his face. He found footprints in the snow. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Daniel followed them for several meters. Then they vanished beneath the fresh snow. He returned to Emma. "We're not alone." Emma looked frightened. "Rescuers? I don't know." Daniel decided they couldn't wait. The aircraft had limited supplies. They needed water and food. He remembered seeing a frozen river several hundred meters from the crash site. If they could melt snow and find signs of wildlife, they might survive long enough for rescue. Daniel built a small sled from aircraft panels. He loaded it with supplies. Emma insisted on coming. Together they left the wreckage. Every step was exhausting. The snow reached their knees. The wind pushed against them. After nearly an hour, they reached the river. Daniel broke through the ice near the edge and collected snow and water. Then he noticed something. Caribou tracks. Fresh ones. Daniel followed them toward a rocky ridge. He eventually found a small frozen carcass. It wasn't enough for a meal, but it proved animals were nearby. He began cutting what meat he could carry. Then he heard a sound. A crack. Daniel turned. A large piece of ice broke beneath Emma. She fell through. Daniel threw himself forward. He grabbed her wrist. The freezing water pulled her downward. "Don't let go." Daniel dug his boots into the ice. Emma screamed. With everything he had, Daniel pulled her out. They collapsed on the snow. Emma was shaking violently. Daniel immediately wrapped her in his coat. "We have to get back." But then Daniel noticed something on the opposite side of the river. A metal object was sticking out of the snow. He crossed carefully. It was a radio antenna. Beside it was an old wooden structure buried beneath the ice. Daniel cleared away the snow. A weather station. It had been abandoned years ago. But one cable was still connected to a small antenna. Daniel opened the door. Inside was a dead generator, a radio, and a map. Daniel turned on the radio. Static filled the room. Then a voice appeared. 718. Respond. Daniel froze. Someone was searching for them. He grabbed the microphone. "This is Flight 718. Static." Then, "Flight 718. We know where you are." Daniel stared at Emma. The voice continued. "Do not leave the crash site." The radio went dead. Daniel returned to the wreckage before sunset. He told Emma what happened. Someone had located them, but the message had been strange. Why tell them not to leave? Daniel studied the aircraft. Something wasn't right. He searched the cargo compartment again. This time, he found a locked metal case. It wasn't listed on the passenger manifest. Daniel broke the lock. Inside were several electronic devices and a satellite transmitter. Emma stared at it. Why wasn't this on the emergency equipment list? Daniel didn't answer. He turned the transmitter on. Nothing happened. Then he noticed a serial number. It had been deliberately scratched away. Daniel began wondering whether the crash had been an accident. Before he could investigate further, the storm returned. They moved deeper inside the wreckage. Daniel reinforced the walls with luggage and metal panels. Then he built a small fire using aircraft insulation and emergency fuel. For several hours, they stayed warm. Emma finally admitted she had been afraid since the crash. Daniel told her, "Fear keeps you alive. Panic gets you killed." She smiled weakly. "You sound like your father." Daniel looked away. "My father died rescuing climbers." "How?" "Same mountains. Different country." Silence filled the cabin. Later that night, Daniel heard footsteps. He immediately extinguished the fire. Emma whispered, "Animal?" Daniel shook his head. The footsteps moved around the aircraft. Slowly, carefully, Daniel grabbed a metal rod. The footsteps stopped. Something scraped against the fuselage. Then a shadow passed across the broken window. Daniel waited. Nothing. He crawled toward the opening. Outside, the snow was untouched. But beside the aircraft was a fresh footprint. A human footprint. Daniel followed it for several meters. Then he found something half buried beneath the snow. A backpack. Inside was food, medical supplies, and a photograph. Daniel looked at it. It showed a group of people standing beside a research station. One man had been circled in red. Daniel recognized him. He was the same man whose voice had spoken through the radio. On the back of the photograph was a date. 3 days before the crash. Daniel suddenly understood. Someone had been watching the aircraft before it went down. The next morning, Daniel decided they had to reach the old research station. If someone was operating equipment in the region, it might contain a working radio. They packed whatever supplies remained. Emma carried the medical kit. Daniel carried the transmitter. The journey was brutal. Snow fell horizontally. Visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. They tied themselves together with a rope so they wouldn't become separated. Hours passed. Then Daniel spotted something. A line of wooden poles. They followed it. The poles led toward a valley. At the end stood an abandoned research station. The doors were buried beneath snow. Daniel forced one open. Inside was darkness, but unlike the aircraft, the building was insulated. They found old sleeping quarters, a kitchen, medical equipment, and generators. Daniel managed to start one. Lights flickered on. Emma nearly cried with relief. They had shelter. Then Daniel found the radio room. The equipment was old but functional. He transmitted an emergency signal. Flight 718 survivor requesting immediate rescue. Static. Nothing. He tried again. This time a voice answered. Daniel Carter. Daniel froze. The voice knew his name. Who is this? We told you to stay at the crash site. Daniel tightened his grip on the microphone. Who are you? A pause. Then, you weren't supposed to survive. The transmission ended. Emma stared at him. What did they mean? Daniel looked at the equipment. Someone was monitoring them. Someone had known his identity. Then the generator suddenly shut down. The station went dark. Outside, something slammed against the door. Once, twice, then again. Daniel raised the flashlight. Emma grabbed the emergency flare. Another impact shook the building. The door began bending inward. Daniel shouted, "Get upstairs." They ran. The door exploded open behind them. But there was nobody outside. Only the wind. Daniel looked at the snow. A line of footprints led away from the station. They stopped at the edge of the valley. And beside them was a message written in the snow. Go home. Daniel stared at it. Then he noticed another message underneath. If you can. Daniel refused to leave. He knew the research station contained answers. They searched every room. Behind a false wall, Daniel discovered a hidden corridor. It led underground. At the bottom was a small cabin containing batteries, food, maps, and communication equipment. Someone had been living there recently. Emma found a notebook. Daniel opened it. The first page contained a name. Dr. Elias Voss, the same man from the photograph. The notebook described strange aircraft activity over the Arctic. Unauthorized flights, unregistered equipment, missing weather data. Then Daniel found an entry dated 2 weeks earlier. Flight 718 is carrying something they don't want discovered. Daniel turned the page. The next entry was missing. Several pages had been torn out. He searched the cabin. Behind a cabinet he found a second notebook. This one contained coordinates. Daniel entered them into an old navigation device. The coordinates pointed toward a valley approximately 30 kilometers away. Emma asked what was there. Daniel didn't know, but he knew they had to find out. Before leaving, Daniel examined the mysterious transmitter. It had one stored message. He played it. A recording began. Flight 718 is scheduled to transport a classified geological sample. Daniel stared at the device. The crash wasn't random. The aircraft had been carrying something valuable. Something someone wanted. The recording continued. If the aircraft goes down, retrieve the container before authorities arrive. Daniel looked at Emma. Someone caused this. Suddenly the lights turned on. They hadn't touched the generator. The radio activated by itself. A voice spoke. You should have stayed in the wreckage. Daniel grabbed the microphone. Who are you? The answer came immediately. Someone trying to keep you alive. Daniel looked toward the window. A helicopter appeared above the mountains. It was flying low. No rescue markings. It landed several hundred meters from the station. 3 armed figures stepped out. Emma whispered, "Rescuers?" Daniel shook his head. "They're here for something." The helicopter door opened. A man stepped out. Daniel recognized him. Dr. Elias Voss. Voss entered the station carrying a rifle. He didn't look surprised to see Daniel alive. "I knew you'd find the transmitter," he said. Daniel demanded answers. Voss explained that Flight 718 had been transporting a geological sample discovered beneath the Arctic ice. The sample was valuable. Several organizations wanted it. The aircraft's navigation system had been deliberately altered. But Voss claimed he hadn't caused the crash. Then who did? Voss looked toward the mountains. People who don't want that sample found. Daniel refused to trust him. Voss told them there was a second emergency aircraft waiting at a remote landing strip. He offered to take them there. Daniel noticed something. Voss's men were searching the station. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for the missing container. Daniel realized the container was still inside the crashed aircraft. He and Emma escaped through the underground tunnel. They ran into the snow. Behind them, gunshots echoed. Daniel pulled Emma toward a narrow canyon. They hid beneath an overhang. The helicopter circled overhead. Daniel knew they couldn't stay there. They followed the coordinates from Voss's notebook. The canyon eventually opened into a frozen valley. There they found a metal container half buried in the snow. Daniel dug it out. Inside was a sealed scientific case. He opened it. The contents were unlike anything he'd ever seen. But before he could examine them, the ground shook. A deep crack formed beneath their feet. The ice began collapsing. Daniel grabbed Emma. They ran. The valley fractured behind them. The helicopter appeared overhead. Voss shouted through a loudspeaker, "Leave the case." Daniel kept running. They reached the opposite ridge. The helicopter couldn't follow, but the storm was returning. Daniel looked at the case. Whatever was inside had caused all of this. Then Emma noticed something. A tracking device was attached beneath it. "They can find us." Daniel removed the device. Then he threw it into a deep crevasse. The helicopter followed the signal. It moved away. Daniel smiled. For the first time, they had escaped. But they still had 30 kilometers of Arctic wilderness between them in safety. Daniel and Emma continued through the mountains. They had food for 2 days. The storm gave them less than 6 hours of daylight. Daniel knew they were running out of time. They found a narrow cave before nightfall. Inside, they started a small fire. Emma examined the case. "Do you know what this is?" "No." "Then why are people willing to kill for it?" Daniel looked at the sealed container. "Maybe because they don't want anyone else to know." During the night, Emma developed a fever. Daniel used the remaining medical supplies. He stayed awake beside her. Outside, the storm screamed. At dawn, Daniel discovered their footprints had been covered. But something else was visible. A helicopter had landed several kilometers away. They were being tracked again. Daniel packed their belongings. They left the cave. The journey became increasingly dangerous. They crossed frozen rivers, climbed cliffs, dragged themselves through snow. Emma eventually collapsed. "I can't continue." Daniel refused to leave her. He built a sled, then pulled her himself. Every step became painful. Hours later, they reached a ridge. Daniel saw something in the distance. A tower. A communications tower. If they reached it, they could transmit a distress signal. They pushed forward. Then Daniel heard engines. The helicopter was back. He dragged Emma behind a rock. The helicopter hovered above them. A searchlight swept across the snow. Daniel waited. The light moved away. He pulled Emma toward the tower. They reached the control building. Inside was a working emergency transmitter. Daniel switched it on. Mayday. This is Daniel Carter, Flight 718 survivor. We need immediate rescue. Static. Then another voice. Daniel, this is Arctic Rescue. Daniel almost cried. How long? 3 hours. Daniel closed his eyes. 3 hours. They could survive 3 hours. Then the rescue operator said, Daniel, we have one problem. What? The coordinates you're transmitting from. A pause. Don't exist. Daniel looked through the window. The tower outside had disappeared. He was standing inside an abandoned building, and the walls were covered with photographs of Flight 718. Daniel realized the building wasn't a communications station. It was an old observation facility. Every photograph showed the crash site, the passengers, the aircraft, even Daniel. But some photographs were taken before the crash. Someone had been following them. Daniel found the missing pages from Boss's notebook. They revealed the truth. The geological sample wasn't valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because of what it could prove. Under the Arctic ice was evidence of an enormous underground structure, something that had been buried for thousands of years. The flight had been sent to photograph the region. Someone had sabotaged the aircraft to prevent the discovery. But the sabotage had failed. Daniel had survived, and he had accidentally found the evidence. Then Boss entered the building. He lowered his weapon. You understand now? Daniel asked. Did you crash the plane? Boss shook his head. No. Who did? Boss looked toward the mountains. The company that sent you here. Daniel stared at him. The entire expedition had been a cover. His photography assignment had been designed to place him on the aircraft. He had been chosen because his camera could capture high-resolution images of the terrain. Daniel looked at his camera. He had hundreds of photographs. He connected it to the computer. The final photograph appeared. It showed the crash site from above. Behind the aircraft was a strange pattern in the ice. A massive circular structure. Daniel zoomed in. The structure was impossible. Boss whispered. That's why they wanted you dead. Suddenly explosions shook the building. Boss's men had arrived. Boss told Daniel to run. He handed him a small satellite transmitter. Get to the ridge. Daniel grabbed Emma. They escaped through a rear tunnel. Behind them, the facility exploded. They climbed toward the highest ridge. Daniel activated the transmitter. A signal appeared. This time, it worked. A rescue aircraft answered. Signal locked. Daniel collapsed into the snow. Emma smiled. They found us. Daniel looked toward the horizon. A helicopter appeared. For the first time, it wasn't hunting them. It was coming to save them. 3 hours later, Daniel and Emma were rescued. The helicopter carried them toward civilization. Daniel looked through the window at the endless Arctic landscape. Below them was the crash site. The wreckage was barely visible beneath the snow. 48 hours earlier, Daniel had believed nobody would ever find them. Now he was going home. But the story didn't end there. When Daniel reached the hospital, government investigators questioned him for hours. They asked about the crash, the storm, the mysterious facility, the geological case. Daniel told them everything. But there was a problem. The case was gone. He had left it with Voss. And Voss had disappeared. The official investigation concluded that Flight 718 had crashed because of mechanical failure. No sabotage was mentioned. No underground structure. No mysterious facility. No Voss. Daniel knew the truth. Weeks later, he returned home. He opened his camera. Most of the photographs were damaged. Except one. The final photograph. Daniel enlarged it. The circular structure beneath the ice was visible. But there was something else. A tiny figure stood beside the entrance. Daniel zoomed closer. His blood ran cold. It was Voss. But the photograph had been taken before the crash. Before Daniel had ever met him. Then Daniel noticed a timestamp. 6 hours before Flight 718 departed. Someone had been inside the structure before the aircraft even took off. Daniel closed the computer. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Nobody spoke. Then a man's voice whispered. Daniel. Daniel recognized it. Boss, how are you alive? Boss didn't answer. Instead he said, you survived the crash. A pause. But you still haven't survived what comes next. The call ended. Daniel looked outside. Snow began falling over the city. On his desk was the photograph. For a moment, he thought he saw something moving beneath the ice. Then the screen went black. 4 months later, Flight 719 disappeared. No wreckage was ever found. No passengers were recovered. And in the final frame, an old satellite image appears. Deep beneath the Arctic ice, a circular structure is glowing. The end.